I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Ricketts. Thank you all for listening. If this is your first time listening to the show, I might recommend starting with a different episode. This is usually, this is a poetry podcast. The old slogan I used was a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This episode is about a very other and a very intractable problem. There's going to be a little bit of poetry, I think, toward the end, but if you're really looking for poetry, then you can go to almost any other of the now 82 episodes on the public feed, or you can go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show. There's 20 episodes up there now and a couple of bonuses, and there are a few more coming every month. It tends to be slightly however ill-advised and incautious this podcast is on a regular basis, that is where it is even more so. So I thank you all and welcome. Just one more time, this is not a typical episode, but I hope it will be a worthwhile one. I have been planning this for a long time, or rather, I have been chewing this over for a long time, and have sat down to record a number of times. I've made a lot of notes, read a lot of books, and I finally I think I'm just going to give it a try. Day of, it's Wednesday. I'm going to probably give this only a slight edit and just have done with it, because I'm not really sure how much more I can meditate on it. All right, in her 2006 stand-up comedy special, Jesus is Magic, Sarah Silverman boasted that she would be the first comic to shit on Martin Luther King. Today, I guess I'm going to be the first podcaster to shit on beloved author, internationally celebrated inspirational speaker, and a universally venerated Holocaust survivor, Viktor E. Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, a fabulously successful book. The cover of my edition claims that it has sold 12 million copies, at least when that edition came out it had done. So it's probably sold even more by now. It has been recommended to me by family, by friends, by neighbors, by strangers. When I bought a copy at the bookstore, the young, hip guy who sold it to me said, "Oh, I just got a copy of this book. It's supposed to be great." This is a book that is given as a gift to graduates, to divorcees, to widowers, to people having a midlife crisis, to people having a quarter-life crisis. It is given, it is recommended, it is talk-showed, it is bundled in self-help packages. It could not be more celebrated. It is hard to think of another book that is more universally respected, because even if they're books that sell more copies, there are few books that everybody seems to treat with the kind of reverence that they treat Man's Search for Meaning. So this is the episode in which I tell you that Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl is actually a terrible, terrible book. And that it's not just a badly done book or a disappointing book. It's actually, I think, maybe an actively harmful book. I think it is a bad book. So just to let you know where we're going, maybe a little bit of a circuitous route to get there, but that's what we're doing this week. Thank you for having some patience with me. I have, for the last year, been working on a private research and writing project for a New York family. I've been doing writing about their patriarch who survived Auschwitz, and it's been an extraordinary experience. I've learned a great deal. Brian got me the gig, which was very kind of him. I have been very pleased with the work I've been able to do so far. We're kind of getting toward wrapping it up. The family has been nothing but generous and supportive. It has been a really wonderful and richly instructive experience all around. Now, I previously had studied the Holocaust in elementary school, middle school, high school, in the typical way American school children do. In college, I went to Hungary and took a course there on the Holocaust in Hungary. I visited Auschwitz 1 and 2. Auschwitz was not just one location. It was actually a complex of something like 40 sites. But the original site, Auschwitz 1, which is the original location of the Arbeit macht frei sign, and I think that is where they first implemented what Camus refers to as the Little E's, which is an old medieval torture. And then Auschwitz II at Birkenau is maybe is what most people think of when they think of Auschwitz. It's the giant brick gate with the train tracks running into the camp, and 1 million people murdered. And, beyond that, I have read a number of books about the rise of the Third Reich. Berlin Diary by William Shearer is, I think, a particularly helpful book for giving a sense of what it was like to be in Germany while this was beginning to happen. What's his name? Eric Larson's In the Garden of Beasts, named after the Tiergarten in Berlin, is a little. It's very poppy, but it's I think instructive. I've already talked with Brian a little bit on the show about Albert Speer's Inside the Third Reich, which is a very morally compromised but still really informative book. I say all this just to say that I am not any kind of scholar, not any kind of expert, really truly just a dilettante, but I know more than the average bear about the Holocaust and the Third Reich. This is before beginning this project, during which time I've read transcripts, interviews. I have interviewed family members of survivors. I've watched interviews of survivors directly from the Shoah Foundation, which has been really helpful. The Yad Vashem has an extraordinary online database, as do a number of other Holocaust museums and foundations. I've been very lucky in getting access to a lot of first and secondhand records from the family, as well as from public sources and private sources after some petition. In addition to this sort of more focused research, I also read Elie Wiesel's book Night, which Brian and Ryan both strongly recommended. It is a staple of American school children being introduced to the Holocaust, and it is well worth reading. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I also read Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi. I found that to be probably the single best book I've read specifically on the camps. And it was while I was reading Survival in Auschwitz, I talked to a neighbor who said, "Oh, well, if you've read those two books, you have to read the next book you have to read is Man's Search for Meaning," which, as I said, several other people had already recommended. I will make a note here that whatever my largely wobbly self-education on the Holocaust has been, which has been, as I said, not trifling, even if it is, far from scholarly. My experience in talking to Jewish friends is that there is a depth, an intensity, and an earliness of education about the Holocaust among at least middle class Western Jews. I mean, I'm sure it's also the case in Israel, but basically the most educated Jews I know have ready to hand just an extraordinary amount of raw information about the Holocaust. It is quite understandably a subject in which they are deeply schooled from a very early age. Enough so that whatever I know, it didn't really even compare to being someone who's currently immersed in the subject, my knowledge still was, at best occasionally par with the knowledge of most of my Jewish friends. Notably, everyone I can think of who recommended Man's Search for Meaning, including all of the blurbs on the back of the book, with the exception of Harold Kushner, who wrote the introduction, all of these recommendations have come from Gentiles. Brian, who knows far more about the subject than I do and who has read everything about the subject, had only vaguely heard of this book. I think, I'm going to come back to this topic, but I think in some ways it is actually a Christian book. But let me start by talking a little bit about Night. So Night is a book that Elie Wiesel wrote. It was published in 1965, I think. No, sorry, it was published in the 50s, and then it was finally published in French edition in 1958 and an English edition in 1960. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Later, this book had not a little bit to do with it. It is roughly so it's basically, I would describe this book as a 100-page scream. It is extremely fleet. It is a lyric first, a narrative second, and a history third. It recounts a story that is very close to Wiesel's own. It's a narrative about a boy named Eli, short for Eliezer, who is grows up Jewish in Romania and then is transported through. I don't know what the borders with Hungary were at the time, but he ends up being deported ultimately to Poland and to Auschwitz with his father. The rest of his family is killed, and he and his father spend most of the war in the camp, helping each other survive until the end, when his father dies and Ellie alone makes it out. It is harrowing. It is moving. It is, as Brian has talked about, it is exceedingly economical without ever feeling rushed. It's a really extraordinary piece of writing, well worth reading. It is currently sort of fashionable, especially among leftists, to dismiss Night. I think this is largely for sort of one reason masquerading as another. Wiesel, as I understand it, I believe he's now deceased. I don't remember, but he for much of his very long life I think maybe most, if not all of his long life, he was a very vocal supporter of Israel, and to an extent to which he's riled up plenty of people who have criticisms of Israel. I know next to nothing about any of that and have no interest in discussing it. The argument that a lot of leftists seem to make about Night is that it is historically inaccurate, that the story that he tells is not his own story exactly. I think this is basically a bullshit line of criticism. I think that the book, even among people who praise it, is sort of referred to as a narrative. Sometimes some people refer to it as a novel. Wiesel called it his deposition. It is, as I said, it is chiefly lyric. It is a howl of pain that is extraordinarily effective in communicating that pain. And even if Wiesel were not a survivor at all, this book would still fundamentally be true, because it is an account of an experience that hundreds of thousands, that millions of European Jews underwent, coming from one place or another, ending up at one camp or another. It is telling a basically true story, regardless of what all of the particulars are. I also think that arguments about the accuracy of individual Holocaust narratives are pretty misguided in general. I mean, think about how little you agree with your wife about an argument you had 1 hour ago. And then imagine being crammed into a cattle car with 80 other people given a bucket, sent through freezing cold weather for days and days and days on end, being given minimal water, if any, often surviving off of snow and icicle drippings from the edges of the few windows that were accessible by those on the very far, very outside between the boards covering them over, and then being thrust out of this train car, at a point at which a fifth of the people in the train car are already dead. You are told to leave behind all of the luggage that you packed with you. You are then immediately separated from the women in your group, or the men in your group if you're a woman. You are then swiftly divided into two lines, one of which seems to contain all of the old, sick, weak, and handicapped people, and one of which contains all of the attractive or strong or large people. And then half of you are marched off toward a building with a big squared off smokestack, and half of you are told to stand there and kept standing for the next 24 hours sometimes. I mean, just imagine how shocking, disorienting, and bewildering this might be just for the very first moments of arrival at a camp like Auschwitz. So add to that confusion, discrepancy, inconsistency, and doubt were all very much part of the Nazis' design. All of which is to say that Night and Survival in Auschwitz, and even to an extent Man's Search for Meaning, are all well worth reading for the sake of learning about the camps. Man's Search for Meaning is only, though, partly about that. Very quickly, because I do have a few passages I want to cite from Levy's book. Primo Levy's Survival in Auschwitz. It was first published in Italian as the title was, I don't remember the Italian for it, but it translates to "If This Is a Man," which is a pretty chilling title. It is partly an account of his time in Auschwitz, but it is, where Wiesel was a teenage aspiring rabbinical student when he was deported. Primo Levi, who was in the mountains with the Italian resistance at the time of his arrest, but he before that was a professional chemist. He was about 10 years older than Wiesel, and he was a professional chemist for many decades after the war as well. He was even a chemist in Auschwitz. I mean, that is largely why he survived. There is, by the way, the single most important factor in surviving Auschwitz was getting there late. That almost every Auschwitz survivor didn't spend that much time there because, the great majority of those who came to Auschwitz at all, as many as 70% of a given train load, were executed on arrival. Were marched off the train and then immediately gassed. One of the truest things that Frankl says is that the best of us did not survive. He changes that tune later in a kind of a disturbing way. Levy's book is less of a lyric, less of a narrative, and more of a series of analytical essays, rather than, he acknowledges, of course, the colossal scale of murder that took place at Auschwitz, but his focus is on the mechanics of everyday survival. If you were lucky and did survive, what did that entail on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis? How you dealt with food, how you dealt with clothing, how you dealt with being sick or not being sick or trying not to be sick or trying to get into the sick ward for just the right periods of time but not for others, how you dealt with theft and trade in the black market, and most of all, how you dealt with the intra-camp hierarchy. Because the SS, just like the Afrikaners, just like American slave owners, were very adept at using those that they had power over in order to keep each other in line. They appointed capos, Blockeltesters, Lagerkampos, all of these different tiers of prisoner functionary. In some cases, these were non-Jewish prisoners. The capos are the most notorious, the sort of the work foremen, who were in many cases non-Jewish criminal prisoners, and so they were frequently violent sadists to begin with, and then they were put in a position of being able to inflict more violence on those under them. But Levy is very attuned to this hierarchy. A hierarchy, he says, that is defined as much by luck and the appearance of good luck, or the appearance of fortunate association, as it had to do with actual usefulness or barter or any kind of obvious mercenary advantage. He tells one story about a captain of industry who made a point of washing his shirt every day, which meant literally washing it and then sleeping with it wet on his body so he didn't lose it, so that his shirt was always clean, and he shaved his face every day, which required, of course, trading away food and other advantages in order to access what he needed for that, in order to present a respectable appearance. And as Levy recalls, this trick panned out for him, and he was finally selected as a Blockle tester or some kind of camp leader at some point, simply because of his impressive appearance. And from there, he kind of leveraged that advantage, one to the other. And Levy has a pretty cutting farewell remark for him. Okay, he concludes his story of Alfred L., who became what Levy calls a prominent in the camp. The thing you wanted to do was be a prominent. So he was named the head of a chemical commando. And then Levy's parting words on him are, "I do not know how his story continued, but I feel it is quite probable that he managed to escape death and today is still living his cold life of the determined and joyless dominator." So he's pretty eloquent when it comes to the way people got by, good, bad, and usually pretty ugly. He says, "There comes to light the existence of two particularly well differentiated categories among men, the saved and the drowned. Other pairs of opposites, the good and the bad, the wise and the foolish, the cowards and the courageous, the unlucky and the fortunate, are considerably less distinct. They seem less essential, and above all, they allow for more numerous and complex intermediary gradations. This division is much less evident in ordinary life, for there it rarely happens that a man loses himself. A man is normally not alone, and in his rise or fall is tied to the destinies of his neighbors, so that it is exceptional for anyone to acquire unlimited power, or to fall by a succession of defeats into utter ruin. But in the lager, things are different." The lager is, of course, the name for one of the German word for the camp. "Here, the struggle to survive is without respite, because everyone is desperately and ferociously alone. In history and in life, one sometimes seems to glimpse a ferocious law which states, 'To he that has will be given. From he that has not will be taken away.' In the lager, where man is alone and where the struggle for life is reduced to its primordial mechanism, this unjust law is openly in force, is recognized by all." He goes on, "At Auschwitz in 1944, of the old Jewish prisoners, we will not speak of the others here, as their condition was different. Kleine Nummer, low numbers, less than 150,000. Low number was somebody who had arrived early in camp. The lower the number, the more seniority you had, and the more extraordinary your survival. Of the low numbers, less than 150,000, only a few. The numbers less than 150,000. Only a few hundred had survived. Not one was an ordinary Häftling, which is a prisoner, vegetating in the ordinary commandos and subsisting on the normal ration. Meaning, if you were a normal, ordinary prisoner, you didn't make it. There remained only the doctors, tailors, shoemakers, musicians, cooks, young attractive homosexuals, friends or compatriots of some authority in the camp, or they were particularly pitiless, vigorous, and inhuman individuals installed, right? The worst, the most vicious, the most self-serving, the most sadistic of the prisoners were installed following an investiture by the SS command, which showed itself in such choices to possess satanic knowledge of human beings. The SS had a special gift for identifying sadists, for identifying people to put in positions of power such that they would abuse it. They were put in positions such as capos, Blockeltester, etc. Blockeltester is senior block warden, is one way to translate that. This was the same system that the the Nazis used in the ghettos, even before the camps. In the Lodz ghetto, the second largest city in Poland, second largest ghetto in Poland after the Warsaw ghetto, or an orphanage owner named Chaim Rumkowski was named the elder of the ghetto and the head of the Jewish elder of Lodz, and he appointed a Judenrat, which was the Nazi-approved Jewish council that basically worked as a local arm to carry out the designs of the Nazis. Rumkowski was totally ruthless as he called himself king of the ghetto. He met personally with Himmler. He had his entire own Judenrat, his own council that he had appointed. He had them all denounced and executed at one point and then replaced with a completely new council. He saw to the deportation of all of the children in the Lodz ghetto. Early on, he had all of the children deported to Auschwitz. And then once the ghetto was fully liquidated, as they called it, he himself was, of course, sent to Auschwitz as well. This is a very standard part of the SS protocol. Levy says that if you were not somebody who was able to get in good with a capo, with a local tester, with one of these officials, one of these sort of prisoner functionaries, if you were not somebody who was able to get in good with them, if you were not somebody who was a prominent, who had some kind of edge, some kind of advantage, a skilled, some kind of professional skill that you could put to use. Whosoever does not know how to become an organizator, an combinator prominent, soon becomes a Musulman. Musulman. This is a term all three writers use. It was Auschwitz slang for somebody who had given up the will to live. Musulman literally means something like Mohammedan. It's an old, outdated term for a Muslim. And there's not any clear derivation I have found, or rather there are a number of hypothetical etymologies, one of which was that I think some prisoners after a head injury would wear rags wrapped around their heads and so looked like they were wearing turbans. There are a number of other possible etymologies. At any rate, it was the universal term at Auschwitz for somebody who had gone dead in the eyes before he died in his body. Levy said, "You soon, if you don't have an edge, you soon become a Musulman. In life, a third way exists, and is in fact the rule. Right? In life, most people are just getting by. They're neither hapless victims nor are they ruthless killers. They are just coasting through the middle way. The middle way, as he says, does not exist in the concentration camp. To sink is the easiest of matters. It is enough to carry out all the orders one receives, to eat only the ration, to observe the discipline of the work in the camp. Experience showed that only exceptionally could one survive more than 3 months in this way." Levy himself survived in Auschwitz way longer than the average survivor. He arrived in 1943. I mean, most people who ended up surviving Auschwitz arrived in late 1944. The camp was mostly emptied in January of 1945, and then the Soviets liberated the remaining prisoners at the end of January. The rest of them were marched off to Gliwice and to various other camps. Levy got there in 1943. He survived almost 2 years. I think he was certainly there for 2 full winters in Auschwitz, which is truly extraordinary. And were it not for a couple of very close friends that he developed in the camp and his own privilege as a chemist, he certainly would not have survived. Even so, I mean, he describes the last days in Auschwitz when all of the resources for the camp were gone, when cholera was ripping through the survivors of the camp, when they were all desperate to find clean snow to melt down and drink for water. He describes both working very hard to help those who were in his barracks with him and barring the doors of the barracks and beating away other prisoners to keep them out so that they could not get at the heat and the remaining resources that those inside had managed to squirrel away. So, I mean, he directly describes having to prevent other prisoners from surviving in order to achieve his own survival. He is utterly unromantic about what it took to survive in Auschwitz. The first thing being, of course, good timing and luck. He says early on, there's a really memorable moment in which he's dying of thirst soon after his arrival. Driven by thirst, I eyed a fine icicle outside the window within hand's reach. I opened the window and broke off the icicle, but at once a large, heavy guard prowling outside brutally snatched it away from me. Warum? I asked in my poor German. Why? Hier ist kein Warum, was the guard's reply. Hier ist kein Warum. Here is no why. Later on, he has a friend named Klausner who, he says, most prisoners carved their names into the bottom of their bowls. You had to keep your bowl and your spoon on you at all times or you would lose it. Klausner shows me the bottom of his bowl. Where others have carved their numbers, and Alberto and I our names, Klausner has written, ne pas chercher à comprendre. I don't speak French, so I forgive my pronunciation, but ne pas chercher à comprendre means, if I'm not mistaken, do not seek to understand. These seem to be the morals, if there are any, of survival in Auschwitz. Here is no why. Do not seek to understand. He says, we now invite the reader to contemplate the possible meaning in the lager of the words good and evil, just and unjust. Let everybody judge on the basis of the picture we have outlined and of the examples given above how much of our ordinary moral world could survive on this side of the barbed wire. The third book was Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was also at Auschwitz. He transferred from there to Dachau and to a few other camps. He was eventually at Turkheim, which was a sub-camp of Kaufering. One of the reasons it's difficult to criticize him is because first, he did something truly extraordinary, which is to say he survived a concentration. He survived a death camp and several other concentration camps. He made it through some of the very worst conditions imaginable. And that achievement can never be dismissed or diminished. I certainly have no wish to do so. And so insofar as Man's Search for Meaning is his account of having done that, again, I can do nothing but listen in reverent silence. The problem is that that's not mostly what it is. I misremembered. It doesn't say over 12 million copies sold on the front. It says over 16 million copies sold. So the first part of this book is called Experiences in a Concentration Camp. So I think the original title in German was A Psychologist Goes to a Concentration Camp. So Viktor Frankl was a psychologist. He was in his 40s when he went to the camp. I think late 30s, early 40s when he went to the camp. He was a well-established professional. He was trained in the psychoanalytic tradition. I believe he had some personal correspondence with Sigmund Freud. He was in the psychoanalytic chain of anointment. He was, I think, a degree or two, maybe 2 degrees from Freud. So he was relatively early and enthusiastic practitioner of psychoanalysis. He, as we will get into later, diverged from Freud's theories and developed some of his own. He had published a number of books, and he was a college professor when he was arrested and deported. He describes surviving in the various camps in ways that don't totally, some of which line up with what Levy says, but where Levy is focused mostly on the details, the mechanics of getting by. Frankl is, even in the first half of the book, even in Experiences in a Concentration Camp, he is mostly interested in drawing moral conclusions from his experiences and in assessing the moral value of the prisoners. He does briefly mention that there were some sort of pure sadists among the guards and among some of the capos. He talks about that there were good capos and bad capos, good Blocko testers and bad Blocko testers, good prisoner functionaries and bad prisoner functionaries. He is mostly interested, though, in the moral worth of the ordinary prisoner. He actually is his treatment of the SS is sort of startling. Late in the book, he makes a point of saying that most SS men were pretty good guys. And he even goes so far as to say that the commandant of Turkheim, of the final concentration camp he was at, the guy in charge, the SS Ober something, not Ober, the SS Oberscharführer, Karl Hoffmann, the commandant of Turkheim. Frankel's treatment of him is almost entirely to wax on about what a good man he was, and that he did his job only reluctantly. Hoffmann does seem to have been a less bad SS commandant than many, but he still oversaw a subcamp of Kaufering, it was a work camp, but it had some of the worst conditions among the work camps. And of course, was also a place of frequent and merciless murder, torture, starvation, deprivation en masse. So Frankel's treatment of the perpetrators of the Holocaust is surprisingly light in its touch. His primary question, and this is where I think there is a worthwhile question. I'm trying as I go back through this book, I'm trying to give it the benefit of the doubt. I think the worthwhile question Frankel asks is this: in the worst conditions, when all one wants is to have one's pain removed, is it still possible to make moral choices? Unfortunately, what this ends up meaning is that he spends most of the book chastising other prisoners, talking about the bad ways that some of the prisoners tried to get by versus the good ways. And by bad, I don't just mean manipulative or exploitative. I mean that he would say, if you smoked the cigarettes that you got through the black market, rather than using them as currency, then you were giving up. Whereas if you missed a meal, if you failed to get your daily soup because you were excited by the prisoner talent show that was put on in which people sang songs and told inspirational stories, if you missed a meal because you wanted to see the talent show, that was actually a sign that you were of strong moral character and you were doing the right thing. He spends the second half of the book, I mean, maybe even more than half, talking about, the second half of the book is called Logotherapy in a Nutshell. Logotherapy was Frankel's revision of psychotherapy. Again, I think it has at its heart kind of an interesting proposition. His treatment of Freud is extremely simplistic. He says that Freud believed that man wanted only pleasure, and he seems to think that Freud thought this was like a good thing, like this was something Freud endorsed. Whereas really what Freud is doing is really more of an evolutionary argument, saying people do pursue pleasure. And in fact, pleasure seems to be correlated to what is good for us, even if that can be obviously misguided in the modern day, as we've learned with something as simple as, say, candy, that it is obvious, there's an obvious evolutionary advantage in why candy tastes good, but there are problems in our merely pursuing pleasure as if that were still an inerrant guide to our survival. So, I mean, Freud is a quack when it comes to science, but he's a visionary and a genius and a beautiful writer. Frankel is none of those things, but I think where he has a meaningful contribution, it is in saying that rather than simply trying to unravel the origins of one's neurosis. I mean, Freud seemed to really believe that the principle of a lot of Freud's talk therapy was that if you learned the secret truth about yourself, then you would be cured. That seems to be, in retrospect, a pretty shaky assumption. Frankel's proposition was what most people really want is not to have the mystery of their early life unraveled. What they want is to identify the meaning of their life. Most people want to know, what's the meaning of my life? And he chooses the slightly confusing word logotherapy to mean the therapy of meaning. He is, in his painstaking elaboration of some of Freud's apparatus for psychoanalysis, Frankel is just as much of a quack. The actual official book that he wrote detailing the the ins and outs of logotherapy was 20 volumes long. He was, like Primo Levi, a professional before, during, and after the war. He was, instead of being a chemist or a rabbinical student, he was, in this case, a self-help guru. He was a self-help guru before the war. He was a self-help guru after the war, and he was a self-help guru during the war. Here's an excerpt from a speech he boasts about giving to other prisoners in the camp after a day in which they were punished and were not allowed to eat any food. He gave a long speech that he said was very, very rousing success. It made everybody feel better. He said to his fellow prisoners, he said, I said that someone looks down on each of us in difficult hours, a friend, a wife, somebody alive or dead, or a God, and he would not expect us to disappoint him. He would hope to find us suffering proudly, not miserably, knowing how to die. He goes on, those of us who had any religious faith, I said frankly, could understand without difficulty. I told them of a comrade who, on his arrival in camp, had tried to make a pact with heaven. Let me start that again. This is what he's saying to his fellow prisoners in a concentration camp after a day in which they have been deliberately starved by the SS as punishment for not betraying one of their own. What he told them was, I told them of a comrade who, on his arrival in camp, had tried to make a pact with heaven that his suffering and death should save the human being he loved from a painful end. A man came to the camp and he said, to God, I am willing to suffer as long as you spare the person I love. It's presumably also in some camp, maybe a women's camp or somewhere else. Frankel's own wife died in Bergen-Belsen while he was in Auschwitz, or while he was in Turkheim. He goes on, he says, for this man, suffering and death were meaningful. His was a sacrifice of the deepest significance. He did not want to die for nothing. None of us wanted that. Well, there's just one problem with this beautiful story about a pact with heaven. It didn't work. The pact didn't work. The man didn't want to die for nothing. Of course he didn't want to die for nothing. He made a pact with heaven, saying he would be willing to suffer any pain, any indignity, if his loved one could only be spared. Of course he did. That's a deeply human, sympathetic thing to do. It didn't work. There's I think, a particularly poignant moment in Survival in Auschwitz, when Levi has just described one of the regular selections, these selections that happened throughout their time in the camp, and the SS would, or it wasn't even an SS, it was a camp doctor. It was a prisoner doctor would be brought to assess the physical condition of the prisoners. What would happen is that you would be selected, you'd be chosen either to survive or to be killed. But then it would be a few days before they would take the ones who had been marked to die. So you would be selected, and then you would go right back to your bunk with, a third of the people in the room knowing they'd been marked to be executed in a few days' time. So during this selection, Levi was made the good line. His bunkmate Kuhn made the good line. Beppo made the bad line. Beppo was marked for death. Now everyone is busy scraping the bottom of his bowl with his spoon so as not to waste the last drops of a soup. A confused metallic clatter signifying the end of the day. Silence slowly prevails, and then from my bunk on the top row, I see and hear old Kuhn praying aloud, with his beret on his head, swaying backwards and forwards violently. Kuhn is thanking God because he has not been chosen. Kuhn made the good line. He's praying to thank God because he has not been chosen. Here's Levi's comment on that. And this is how I feel when I read Frankel's speech to his fellow prisoners. Kuhn is out of his senses. Does he not see Beppo the Greek in the bunk next to him? Beppo, who is 20 years old and is going to the gas chamber the day after tomorrow and knows it and lies there looking fixedly at the light without saying anything and without even thinking anymore? Can Kuhn fail to realize that next time it will be his turn? Does Kuhn not understand that what has happened today is an abomination which no propitiatory prayer, no pardon, no expiation by the guilty, which nothing at all in the power of man can ever clean again? If I was God, I would spit at Kuhn's prayer. So I'll read a few more passages from Frankel's book, because the moral of his book, if the moral of Wiesel's book is God has abandoned us, and man is a savage to man. And the moral of Levy's book is that survival is a brutal, brutal task that has no relationship to morality at all. The moral of Frankl's book is very different. Very different. He says, if there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Right? It seems like a simple enough claim to begin with. If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. But it is actually the implications of that seemingly simple conclusion are pretty odious. Here's some of them. Here lies the chance for a man either to make use of or to forego the opportunities of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may afford him. By difficult situation, he's talking about a death camp, a Nazi death camp. He goes on, and this decides whether he is worthy of his sufferings or not. The question is not, why is this happening? The question is, are you worthy of your sufferings? Psychological observations of the prisoners, this is Frankl, psychological observations of the prisoners have shown that only the men who allowed their inner hold on their moral and spiritual selves to subside eventually fell victim to the camp's degenerating influences. I'll read that one more time. Only the men who allowed their inner hold on their moral and spiritual selves to subside eventually fell victim to the camp's degenerating influences. Here's another passage. We have already spoken of the tendency there was to look into the past, to help make the present, with all its horrors, less real. This is, again, talking about the wrong way to survive Auschwitz. If you tried to live in a fantasy, if you tried to forget what was happening, if you tried to daydream, this was wrong. Why? In robbing the present of its reality, there lay a certain danger. It became easy to overlook the opportunities to make something positive of camp life. Daydreaming was wrong because it became easy to overlook the opportunities to make something positive of camp life. Now, by something positive, he doesn't mean getting a little extra bread, getting shoes that fit. He doesn't mean getting a little break from the cold. He means finding an opportunity to test the strength of your moral soul against your suffering, to see if you are worthy of it. Here is his conclusion about what the camp prisoners needed most. What the concentration camp prisoners needed most. Frankl's conclusion? What was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. He goes on, every situation is distinguished by its uniqueness, and there is always only one right answer to the problem posed by the situation at hand. There is always only one right answer to the problem posed by the situation at hand. He has this funny question. So the second half of the book, as I said, he mostly spends explaining logotherapy, explaining his quack psychiatric practice, and of the moralizing threads that dangle from the first half of his book, which is his camp narrative. He kind of weaves an enormous, elaborate wall tapestry of moral lectures, grounded in his pseudoscientific practice and stamped with authority by his experience in the camp. He repeats again and again and again, I'm not just a psychiatrist, I'm also an Auschwitz survivor. He uses that frequently to endorse what he's saying, to prove that if I, an Auschwitz survivor, can have maintained my moral cleanliness, then you too can do the same. Much of the book is given over to examples of lectures or rhetorical questions that he offers either fellow camp prisoners or students or patients, and the ways in which his clever constructions wowed those that he offered them to. So here's another example. He's speaking. This is a group therapy for women who have lost their children. Well, I think it's not. It may not be just women, but it's group therapy for for parents who have lost children, for people who've lost loved ones in their close family. And the specific person who is sort of up for consideration at the moment is a woman whose beloved son has died and whose other son is very severely handicapped. So he offers a question to the whole group. He says, the question was whether an ape, which was being used to develop poliomyelitis serum, and for this reason punctured again and again, would ever be able to grasp the meaning of its suffering. It was a lab animal. Saying, could a lab animal who's being effectively tortured to death for the sake of researching medicine for humans, could that lab animal ever grasp the meaning of his suffering? Right? Because the suffering does have a meaning. Unanimously, the group replied that of course it would not. With its limited intelligence, it could not enter into the world of man, i.e. the only world in which the meaning of its suffering would be understandable. Right? The animal is never going to understand why its suffering is meaningful. Then I pushed forward with the following question, and what about man? Are you sure that the human world is a terminal point in the evolution of the cosmos? Is it not conceivable that there is still another dimension, a world beyond man's world, a world in which the question of an ultimate meaning of human suffering would find an answer? Ha ha ha. The crowd was awed and moved, and once again, Dr. Frankl saved the day. So reading this, I was baffled. I couldn't believe that this was the conclusion that he had led his patients to. What Frankl says is, well, the animal can't understand that we're torturing it to death for the benefit of human beings who might someday get medicine that would save them from this terrible disease. But I am not convinced that if the animal could understand that, it would then endorse that explanation. He goes on to say that, of course, we also can't understand much of how the world works. And so possibly this woman's the death of this woman's child, the physical developmental disabilities of her other child, these are not just random acts of badness. They're just not just cruel happenstance. That these are actually designed deliberately. Frankl seems to think that we would happily accept this fate if we knew that, say, cancer was not just a naturally occurring, horrifying disease that kills and disfigures men, women, and children throughout history, seemingly for no reason, at all ages, of all descriptions, at all times and places. But actually, what if cancer were a test designed by godlike aliens and deliberately inflicted upon us for some obscure benefit, not for us, but for them? Maybe 1 million human beings have to die of cancer for every tiny advancement in the aliens' godlike plan for their own benefit. I think that is not just not comforting. I think that's horrifying and infuriating to imagine. And yet for Frankl, this is good enough, and in fact, the good. He says it's actively bad for people to believe that the universe is cruel and empty and meaningless. And it is actively good for them to believe that their sufferings are part of the design of a conscious God who chooses them for us. Here's what I found to be the most odious passage in this book. I will say that there is aside from being recommended solely by Christians, the book as a whole has an oddly Christian quality to it. The introduction is written by Harold Kushner, who I only his last name tipped me off that he wasn't a mainline American Protestant minister, because the way he refers to himself as a clergyman, and the way he talks about God and meaning and morality and the afterlife all just sounds amazingly Christian. Right, like I am certain that there's just an enormous store of Jewish thought and literature that is I'm totally ignorant of, that I know nothing of. I have no doubts about that. But my understanding, not based on nothing, is that the afterlife is not a big focus of Judaism. Right? I reread recently, or a couple of years ago, I reread the first 5 books of the Bible, and there's not really any discussion that I remember of the afterlife in those books, which of course form the Torah, the Pentateuch. There are two incidents in the Bible that are oddly parallel. I may have mentioned this in another episode at some point, but it's worth repeating, I think. So there are these 2 moments when a man goes into the wilderness and he encounters a superhuman voice. And the superhuman voice, in both cases, makes a demand and an offer. The demand is, bow down and worship me. And the offer is what differs. Everything else is the same. Man is in the wilderness, a superhuman voice approaches him, makes a demand that he bow down and worship it. Now, in one case, the man refuses, and that is immediately and obviously understood in the context of the story as being the right thing to do, to refuse the voice. Now, in the other story, the man obeys the voice, and that is immediately and obviously in the context of the story understood as the right thing to do. And so the real difference between these 2 stories is what the voice offers. Now, in the latter example, the voice is the voice of Satan, right? Tempting Jesus in the wilderness. And because we know Jesus is Jesus, and because we know Satan is Satan, we don't even really have to pay attention to what he's offering, because we already know that the right thing to do is to refuse him. But let's look at what the actual offer is. The offer is, let's imagine for a minute that you don't have sort of Jesus' like internal cosmic Rolodex that tells you who everyone is and what it means and what you're supposed to do. Let's imagine you're just a man in the wilderness listening to a voice. What does the voice offer you? The voice says, bow down and worship me, and I will give you food to eat. And he says, bow down and worship me, and I will give you power, riches. He says, bow down and worship me, and I will give you glory. I will let the whole world know how great you are, and that they should all bow down to you, and all you have to do is bow down to me. But these are the wrong offers. When the voice in the wilderness offers you these things, the correct answer is to say no. Now, in the other case, the voice makes a very different offer. The voice says, bow down and worship me, and I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the beach. And the correct response when the voice offers you that is to say yes. That's what Abram said to God in the wilderness, who approached him and made this offer, and he was right to do it. In the context of the story, it's obviously the case. But that's really the only difference, is that offer. And that's pretty consistent throughout the Hebrew scriptures and throughout most of what I know of the Jewish tradition, which is that this is a religion that is focused on living a good life and having a good life for your descendants. And the reward of the Israelites is not heaven, but the promised land, an actual place on earth. That's the big reward. The afterlife really doesn't come up. Now, as I said, there are Jewish mystics, there's the Talmud, there's the Kabbalah, there are all these other things I don't know about. I have no doubt that there's plenty of talk of afterlife in some of those sources, but it's not really the main thing. The afterlife as the focus of the religion is a trait I associate with Christianity and Islam. And this book feels real Christian to me. There is a lot of talk of the afterlife. In fact, a lot of Frankel's arguments for how people should find meaning in suffering are founded specifically on a promise of the afterlife. He frequently uses the expression, every man has his cross to bear. The only thing he cites more often than that is Nietzsche, saying, he who has a why can bear anyhow. This is what I found to be the most despicable moment in this book. By the way, the first title, as I said, was a psychologist goes to the concentration camps. The next, because there were a number of editions, expansions. He added the logotherapy part later. One time the German title was Trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen, which means say yes to life anyway. I mean, truly, like, what immediately came to mind there was the chorus of crucified thieves at the end of The Life of Brian singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life," which really feels like it could be the soundtrack to this whole book. But this is his story, the story that just made me furious. A rabbi from Eastern Europe turned to me and told me his story. He had lost his first wife and their 6 children in the concentration camp of Auschwitz, where they were gassed. And now it turned out that his second wife was sterile. I observed that procreation is not the only meaning of life, for then life itself would become meaningless, and something which in itself is meaningless cannot be rendered meaningful merely by its perpetuation. That, I totally agree with that. I think he's dead on right about that. That the people who say the point of the meaning of life is to have children are thinking in extremely simplistic terms. I think that's an insufferable claim. So I totally agree with him there. However, he goes on, the rabbi evaluated his plight as an Orthodox Jew in terms of despair that there was no son of his own who would ever say Kaddish for him after his death, which is formally understandable, but I actually find that already to be like a pretty repellent expression of grief for the death of your entire family, for the murder of your wife and your 6 children. Nobody's going to say Kaddish for me after I die. It seems like the least of your problems, but whatever. Frankl goes on, but I would not give up. I made a last attempt to help him by inquiring whether he did not hope to see his children again in heaven. However, my question was followed by an outburst of tears, and now the true reason for his despair came to the fore. He explained that his children, since they died as innocent martyrs, were thus found worthy of the highest place in heaven. But as for himself, he could not expect as an old sinful man to be assigned the same place. I did not give up, but retorted, "Is it not conceivable, Rabbi, that precisely this was the meaning of your surviving your children? That you may be purified through these years of suffering, so that finally you too, though not innocent like your children, may become worthy of joining them in heaven? All 6 of your children and your wife were murdered in Auschwitz, but you survived. Maybe God let you survive. I mean, not your wife, I guess, who was also presumably an older sinful adult, but you survived so that you could live out your long life suffering in agony at the murder of your children, so that you could be purified, so that you could then enter the right level of heaven to see your children again." This is Viktor Frankl's advice to a grieving Auschwitz survivor. I'm truly at a loss. I mean, I'm almost as much at a loss for words here as I am at his claim later in the book, which he was fond of saying this at his speeches in America. He said, I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast, which like completely misses the point of the Statue of Liberty, which is like, it's not for us, motherfucker. It's not for us. It's for them. It's for other people coming here. But this is how he treats suffering. I understand and I respect the question of how should someone in the most extreme conditions live? How can someone living in hell live morally? But his insistence on finding this sort of moral opportunism, finding in every cruel wrinkle of chance and of human viciousness to find an opportunity to justify a man's suffering to himself, even using his own dead children as leverage in a vision of heaven, a tiered vision of heaven, which truly seems, just amazingly Christian. It couldn't be more of a Catholic vision of the afterlife. I'm shocked that this is a way that Jews have talked about the afterlife ever and anywhere, but I take him at his word. This is how he helps people. This is how he, as he puts it, the meaning of his life is to help other people find the meaning of theirs. He tells a number of stories in this book about the war, about prison, about Auschwitz, about the other camps. And every single one of these stories seems to bear out his own reasoning, his own logic, his own conclusions. He tells a story of his Blochel tester, which he says he was a good Blochel tester. I mean, again, he couldn't spend more time in this book talking about how the prisoner functionaries that he encountered and the guards he encountered and the SS commandant he encountered were all good guys. But he says that he had a good Blochel tester at one point who became convinced that he had a dream, a vision in which he thought the war was going to end on this particular day in March 1945. Or the camp was going to be liberated, and he was very lighthearted and very happy because he was convinced that this was going to happen. And then the closer they got to that date, the shakier he got until the day before the set date that the camp was supposed to be liberated. The Blochel tester became very ill, and then on the day that he had predicted the camp would be liberated, the Blochel tester died. Because, as Frankl puts it, he'd given up on life. That he had so convinced himself that he could trust in the augury of his dream that he stopped. He gave up his own will to live, and that literally killed him the day that he had predicted the camp would be liberated, and then the next day the camp was liberated. As I said at the beginning, I think arguing about whether particular details of particular Holocaust survivors' memoirs or stories or recollections are purely historically accurate or consistent, I think that's both a mug's game and mostly a repellent activity. But I will say that story and the other stories that Frankl recounted, again, all of which supported his conclusions, all of which supported the psychiatric practice he had already established before going into the camp. All of those stories were so consistent in bearing out exactly what he claimed to be the case that I couldn't help but think of this passage from Tim O'Brien's celebrated story, How to Tell a True War Story. A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things they have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. I'll close with a poem. This has gone on a long time. I'm going to cut it down, but probably not that much. It's going to be a long episode, but fuck it. So I'm just going to close with a poem by Anthony Hecht. This is a very famous poem. I'm only going to read part of it, but I think it is pretty relevant to the question at hand. It's a question of finding the opportunity for your own moral virtue in moments of suffering, focusing not on the suffering, not allowing yourself to daydream, not taking brief moments to find physical respite, to sneak a cigarette or to get a little extra sleep, but pushing yourself to the breaking point at every opportunity in order to become worthy of your suffering, right? The Viktor Frankl way. Here's the end of a poem called More Light, More Light. More Light is Goethe's famous last words, more light. So I'm just going to read the last 2/3 of this poem by Anthony Hecht. We now move to outside a German wood. 3 men are there commanded to dig a hole, in which the 2 Jews are ordered to lie down and be buried alive by the 3rd, who is a Pole. I'm going to read that again so we all get the setting. We now move to outside a German wood. 3 men are there commanded to dig a hole, in which the 2 Jews are ordered to lie down and be buried alive by the 3rd, who is a Pole. Not light from the shrine at Weimar beyond the hill, nor light from heaven appeared. But he did refuse. The Pole refused to bury the 2 Jews alive. A Luger settled back deeply in its glove. Luger is a German pistol. A Luger, so I'll read that stanza again. Not light from the shrine at Weimar beyond the hill, nor light from heaven appeared, but he did refuse. A Luger settled back deeply in its glove. He was ordered to change places with the Jews. The Pole was ordered to lie down in the hole, to be buried alive instead. Much casual death had drained away their souls. The thick dirt mounted toward the quivering chin. When only the head was exposed, the order came to dig him out again and to get back in. No light in the blue Polish eye. When he finished, a riding boot packed down the earth. The Luger hovered lightly in its glove. He was shot in the belly, and in 3 hours bled to death. He was shot in the belly, and in 3 hours bled to death is I think, an excellent use of a rambling, overstuffed line of iambic pentameter. Just the lazily meandering way it makes its way to the final stress, the final slant rhyme, I think is highly effective. No prayers or incense rose up in those hours, which grew to be years, and every day came mute ghosts from the ovens, sifting through crisp air, and settled upon his eyes in a black soot. The 3 men are ordered to dig a grave. The 2 Jews are ordered to lie down in the hole, and the Pole is ordered to bury them alive. He refuses, and so the Jews are told to bury him. They bury him up to his face, and then they're told to dig him back out and to get back in the hole. This time, he buries them alive. The guard shoots him in the belly and lets him bleed painfully to death over the next 3 hours. Here is no why. Do not seek to understand. These seem to me far, far more just and moral responses to a situation like this than the statue of fucking responsibility. I'm going to read this one more time. This is the end of More Light by Anthony Hecht. We now move to outside a German wood. 3 men are there commanded to dig a hole, in which the 2 Jews are ordered to lie down and be buried alive by the 3rd, who is a Pole. Not light from the shrine at Weimar beyond the hill, nor light from heaven appeared, but he did refuse. A Luger settled back deeply in its glove. He was ordered to change places with the Jews. Much casual death had drained away their souls. The thick dirt mounted toward the quivering chin. When only the head was exposed, the order came to dig him out again and to get back in. No light in the blue Polish eye. When he finished, a riding boot packed down the earth. The Luger hovered lightly in its glove. He was shot in the belly and in 3 hours bled to death. No prayers or incense rose up in those hours, which grew to be years, and every day came mute ghosts from the ovens, sifting through crisp air, and settled upon his eyes in a black soot. All right, everybody, that is this week's show. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your patience with this unusual episode. I should have a Secret Show episode out, maybe kind of a silly cotton candy one soon, and I promise a more regular, a more normal episode next week. I have been thinking about this question of meaning, and while I think Frankel more or less bungles it obscenely, I think there's more to say, and I have some thoughts and some questions about it. So I'm going to return to this question of meaning. But for now, thank you all for listening. You can reach me as always at sleerickets@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.